This morning we're going to look at two narratives that converge together. And the first, we're going to start in 1 Samuel chapter 14. So if you can find 1 Samuel chapter 14, which is a story about Jonathan. And then we're going to be skipping ahead to chapter 16, which is a story about David. And the convergence that these two stories have. And what these stories have to do with you and with me. And at the end of it all, the bottom line to, I guess, the things that God desires to do through the lives of every individual is that he doesn't just call us to be faithful, but he actually helps us to be faithful. In that, even to be faithful is something that we cannot take the glory in. That there is a part that we do play, but there's a greater part in which God plays. And that I think if he didn't overwhelmingly show himself as being faithful, I think we would be absolutely faithless, I think. Even though he could give us the testimonies through the Scripture, that if he didn't show himself in so many and so diverse ways and through many people and through many times, that he would never find a faithful person. And I think even when Jesus was walking around in Israel years and years and years ago, one of the things he asked is, when the Son of Man comes again, will he find faith? Because it's such a rare commodity in the world around us. But it's found in Jonathan, it's found in David. And there's a principle in there that I wanted us to look at this morning, and hopefully it'll be something, it'll be food for thought that you can think about this coming week. But in 1 Samuel chapter 13, I said 14, but I'm going to back up to verse 22 in chapter 13. This is the story of Jonathan. On the day of the battle there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan. But Saul and Jonathan his son had them, and the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. One day Jonathan the son of Saul said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men, including Ahijah the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on the one side and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of the one was Bozez, the name of the other Seneh. The one crag rose on the north in front of Michmash, and the other on the south in front of Geba. Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from serving by many or by few." And his armor-bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart, do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul." That's a good line, it's a good sentence to underline. Heart and soul. I'm with you, heart and soul. And I think if there's one thing that God's looking for is people who are bound to him with their heart and their soul. Then Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they say to us, 'Wait until we come to you,' then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up. For the Lord has given them into our hand, and this shall be the sign for us," or to us. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, "Look, Hebrews are coming up out of the holes where they have hidden themselves." And the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor-bearer and said, "Come up to us, and we'll show you a thing." And Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor-bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer killed them after him. And that first strike which Jonathan and his armor-bearer made killed about 20 men within, as it were, half a furrow's length in an acre of land. And among all the people, the garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. And the watchman of Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude was dispersing here and there. Then Saul said to the people who were with him, "Count and see who is gone from us." And when they had counted, behold, Jonathan and his armor-bearer were not there. So Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God here." For the ark of God went at that time with the people of Israel. Now while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into the battle. And behold, every Philistine sword was against his fellow, and there was great confusion. Now the Hebrews who had been with the Philistines before that time, and who had gone up with them into the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they too followed hard after them in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth Aven. And the story that actually comes up before that is that, as we read, is that Jonathan says, "It may be that the Lord will work for us." He's not constricted to a few or to many to carry out what he is going to do. You know, God does desire to fight our battles. He doesn't ask us necessarily to fight our own battles. There are things that we are to carry and to do, but God delights in carrying out his battles, and he does it through his people. I don't know if Jonathan really knew for certain what would happen when they stepped out on the field. He says that it may be that the Lord will work for us. He recognized that God was able and capable of doing a great many things, but this invoked an element of faith on Jonathan's behalf, as it did on his armor bearer. And you know, God fought for people in the past, and God fights for people today, and God fights for you. Particularly when it's his testimony or it's his name that is on the line. And I'm not saying that you go out and pick a battle with things just for the sake of hoping God will show up in things that are unrelated to God. But in the things that deal with God, God does delight in protecting his name. And he gives us the ability to either withstand something that's horrible and terrible, or he gives us the ability to fight through and to take hold of the things that are before us. But he either helps us to stand faithfully and strongly, or he takes delight in getting rid of the thing entirely so we can walk on ahead. David was a similar man. And we went through the story of David and Goliath, so I don't want to go through the entire part. But David shows up, and it's in chapter 17. And he shows up on a battlefield, and Goliath is taunting the army of Israel, and no one's going forward. No one's moving ahead. And so David, because of this, steps up. And in verse 48 in chapter 17, the Philistine arose. It's the same group of people that Jonathan was in war with. Arose and came and drew near to David. David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine, and David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. David prevailed over this Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that the champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sharam as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camps. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son this boy is." And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." There's a common thread to both of these stories, isn't there? And what is that thread that you see in Jonathan and that you also see in David? It seemed like they were driven by really one thing, isn't it? Like what Will is saying. It's their concern was with God, and not so much with the things that are around them. They weren't at all concerned about the comforts or the pleasures or the things around, but they were wrapped up with the name of with God, who God was, His name, His testimony, and that they were men who submitted themselves to this God of Israel. And so they weren't willing to simply just sit back and allow things to go. Jonathan wasn't willing to simply sit back and wait for his father to do something about what was going on. Now, so of course, it's true, Saul had, 600 men. We don't know how many of the Philistines there were, and it was a desperate situation. But Jonathan wasn't willing to simply just sit there and wait it out. He somehow during this process he started thinking about, who am I? Who is God? What are the pleasures of God? What is it the calling He's placed upon my life? And what am I doing? David gets to the front line. And David's looking at this. And David's thinking about, what's going on here? Who's God? Who am I? What are these people? And what is God calling me to do at this time? And they both simply took up what they had and off they went. And I don't think either of them knew really what was going to happen when they went onto the field. I don't know if one had an upper hand over the other in terms of having peace and going out there. Jonathan is going up a cliff with his armor bearer, which seems like a really stupid idea to do. And yet on he goes, because he had a word from God, and he tells his armor bearer, if they tell us to come up, we're going up, because this is of God. And they go. It seemed like it was a hopeless situation, but then they go. David's given a suit of armor that is from the very king. He looks at it, tries it on, says, no, I think I'm going to stick with what works for me. And it's not just a sling and a stone, but he's thinking, God's the one who got me through with the bear and with the lion. So who's this guy? And you see the multitudes that are doing what in all of this? Sitting around and doing nothing while the enemy is taunting them, mocking what's going on. And there's one man who rises up in Saul's camp. And there's another man who rises up in Saul's camp. Jonathan, who wasn't an old man by any means, gets up and goes with his armor bearer. David goes up on his own and goes into the thick of the battle. And away they go. And through their sacrifice and through their vigilance and what they went on, all of a sudden it had an effect in the camps, didn't it? Because as they went forward and carried on the fight, what happened to the people that are around them? Did they just wait for them to come back and say, good stuff, Jonathan. Great, David. If you wouldn't have ran so fast, I would have joined you in the pursuit. But I'm so glad that you went out. No. Once they saw that the fight was at hand and that the tide had turned, it seems like everybody was on the bench. All of a sudden, everybody was a player on the field. But they were waiting around for someone to do something. I wonder if God has the same picture when he looks upon his body. But I don't want to dwell so much on that as I do in what goes on. You've got Jonathan, who's the guy that simply sold out to God. He really could care less if he perished, I think. It was the pursuit that he was after. And then you got David. You got David who, again, I think could care less. I think he could care less if the Philistine actually killed him. At least someone's going to go fight. Someone's going to take up the banner of God and do this. And I think if he perished, it would be, oh well, at least I went out in a fire of glory. At least someone's doing something. And he goes ahead and he does it. They're both two guys that are cut out of the same fabric. And then in chapter 18, it says, as soon as David had come back with Abner, and he says that I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. In chapter 18, there's a beautiful picture. And it's a picture for you and it's a picture for me. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. You see, what's going on is that now David had fought this battle with Goliath and was brought into basically the army of Saul. And as that, David was chosen by Saul to be Saul's armor bearer. So as you go between the story of Jonathan, when he was doing what he was doing, and the story of David and Jonathan got to know each other, I would think, fairly well. And I think there was something in common that they both held. And that was that they were just warriors. They were guys who were just set at fighting for God or taking God's glory seriously. And so that was their life ambition. And so Jonathan could look at David, and David could look at Jonathan, and they could see a reflection of themselves in each other's eyes. And it comes to pass that in the midst of all this, Jonathan does something that is absolutely remarkable. Saul is the king. David is the guy who's anointed by Samuel to become king. Jonathan would be the king apparent. At least that was Saul's ambition. Saul's desire was that when he left, that Jonathan would be the one who would take his place. Jonathan could have made life very difficult for David. Saul certainly did. If Jonathan really wanted to reach out, if Jonathan was really ambitious to pursue his own things that he wanted to benefit him, Jonathan could have made life very horrible and very long for David in continuing the pursuit that his father had called out. But Jonathan, it says here, it says he loved David as his own soul, stripped himself of a robe and gave it to him, put it on, gave David his armor and his sword and his bow and his belt. What does that tell you about the heart of Jonathan? Not only was he passionate about following God, but what else does it show you about the heart of Jonathan? He could have taken David as a threat, but it's like the thought doesn't even go through his head at all. Jonathan doesn't seem to have any selfish motives at all, does he? Whether it's fighting, he knew that David was the king who God would call. But still, Jonathan's out there fighting in the thick of it, not simply just lying back saying, oh well, this is all doomed anyways. The sooner my dad's off this page, the better off it is. It doesn't seem like he doesn't think about that at all. He seems to be a guy who's noble and a guy who's honorable and a guy who desires to simply just to take advantage of the day that's given him in a right pursuit. It's beautiful in terms of this story. And what this has to do with you and with me is that it's almost a beautiful picture of Christ and you, and of Christ and me. Because Christ is the one also who was willing to fight through the battle of humanity and sin in order to set us free. And it's as if Jesus himself also loved us almost as much as you might say, and maybe you could say as much as he loved his own soul. That he was willing to put his life on the line in order to redeem your soul and my soul. And as Jonathan stripped himself of his robe that was on him and gave it to David, isn't that a picture of what Jesus has done for you and for me as well? He had the robe of glory that was due him. And he set that aside and he took up the robe of a servant. And his robe of righteousness, he actually desires to place upon you and upon me. Not only does he give us a robe of righteousness, but as Jonathan gave, it says he gave his armor to David, and so Jesus has given you armor as well, hasn't he? Not something that you can hold in your hand and hack or spear or do anything like that, but he's given us the armor of God, the complete armor of God. Why? So that we can fight a battle that we're ill-equipped to fight. And it says that he gave him his sword and his bow and his belt. These things were not cheap little things that Jonathan gave over to David. They were important things. They were valuable things. They were great things. And you know, the Lord has given you and given me the same thing that Jonathan gave David. It's almost bizarre, but it's almost as if Jesus has given you his heart. Well, it's actually not almost. He did. He has given you and he's given me his heart. And it's not because we deserve it, but he was willing to die for us. He was willing to pursue us. He was willing to go after us. He was willing to give us everything. Everything. No wonder no one will ever get by, that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord, because it's not just because of who he is, but because of what he has done. And as he was willing to fight through David, and as he was willing to fight through Jonathan, and as these two guys went forward, it wasn't as much as David and Jonathan fighting as it was God as the one who was doing it through them. Because they both gave acknowledgement to God that this is his battle, that if he's calling, then this is what's going to happen. They were just kind of like pawns almost going forward. That the same God that fought for David and Jonathan is the same God that will fight for you and for me, in terms of protecting his name and his honor and his glory, which he's given us the blessing and the calling to be actually Jonathan's and David today. But we have to get out from underneath the tree. We have to get off the bench. We have to be able to get out onto the field and trust him. And to know him is the first step, and to follow him. That's why he's left us here. That's why he commonly, when you looked at him going through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he's constantly hitting his head up against religion and the things of which people have made and orchestrated. Instead of, he says, if you really want to know what real religion is, he says, why don't you just take the Sermon on the Mount and just listen to that a few more times? If you really want to know what it is to love God, then just follow me. And you have to be willing to lay down everything to do that. But laying down everything doesn't come easy. Laying down everything isn't cheap, is it? Not if you've seriously thought about it. Not if you've ever even stepped into that water and gave a few things away. But he knows that unless he does that, that we'll be consumed with the things of this world and the things of ourselves, and nothing will happen in terms of the kingdom. But God will fight for you. God will fight for me. He will. Lord, I thank you that you are a passionate God. I thank you that you don't leave us to simply sit on the sideline and watch life go by. Because that would be so easy to do. I thank you that you put hungers and appetites and passions within us that will never ever be satisfied in what this world has to offer us. They will only be satisfied in you. And as we go after you, in order to have these voids filled in our lives, in order to have the strength that we need to move on and to move forward, in order to overcome adversity and strife and to actually know what peace and joy and love really are, Lord, I pray that you would move on our behalf. I'm thankful that you fight the battles that are not only outside of us, but also the battles that rage within us. And you do it because you're not comfortable to simply leave us where we're at. And Lord, I guess maybe every day of all of human history has been the same, in that you so look forward to those who would follow you, who would abandon themselves to you, who would be, in fact, even willing to die for you, if that's what it takes. And I pray, Lord, that you would transform our mind and our heart, that we would be knit with you, heart and soul, just like Jonathan was with you, just like David was with you, just like Jonathan and David were together with you. Lord, that our heart and soul would be knit with you. That we would be willing to do stupid things, if that's what you called us to, in order to be a witness for your name. And that we would go forward and not retreat. And that we would be confident, Lord, in you. And I know there's things that you will take, that you'll put your hand upon, that are sensitive and very tender. And I pray, Lord, that we'd be willing to open up our hand and let go of these things, and not hold on to them tight with a clenched fist, but to acknowledge, and just like the song we sang this morning, that, Lord, that your purposes are good and pleasurable and right, and that you take things that are hard and you use them for purposes because ultimately your purposes are good and perfect and right. And Lord, I'm thankful that you don't tell us to simply give up things that we're not able to give up ourselves, but you're actually able to take those things from us. I thank you, Lord, that you fight for us. You fight for every single one of us. And I'm thankful that we're not people who have to sit on the sidelines of life in this world and be dismayed or be distraught or be depressed about the things that are going on around us, but that you come alongside us and give us strength and purpose and dignity and the ability to not simply exist, but the ability to actually live, and to live for something that is so important. And whether we are moms or whether we are dads or whether we're single, whether we're husbands or wives, I pray, Lord, that you would help us to see this, that you are a God who fights for the mothers. You are a God who fights for the fathers. You are a God who fights for husbands and wives, and you're a God who fights for sons and for daughters. And may we who are old never get in the way of sharing that truth, or sharing that truth, that you would use us, Lord, for your glory and for your kingdom. And it doesn't matter what we're fighting against, Lord. I know you're more than able to overcome that which is set up against us. And so may we simply trust in you. May we recklessly abandon our lives to you and pursue you, even into the thick of a battle, because you're worth it. And not only that, because that's where you're at. That's where you are. And Lord, we're never alone. You'll never leave us nor forsake us. And that's something that we can stake our lives upon. I pray, Lord, for each that's here today. that what we've read and what we know of you would not simply go in one ear and out the other when a challenge faces us, but we would stand upon your word because we're standing on you. And I pray that you bless us. I pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.